Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're jumping into part two of our Identity Operations Lab series. Last time in part one, our goal was basically to build the shell of an application we would eventually use to manage identities and get more information about them. Today, we're basically building on that foundation by adding real functionality to the app while also breaking down the process that all of this is built on. So let's get into it. Right now, the shell of the app pretty much looks convincing from the outside. You can click around in it, the pages are there, and it feels like it should be doing something useful. But under the hood, it is still not actually doing any real work yet. The upload page can take a file, but it does not know how to read that employee data, make sense of it, or really do anything with it after you hand it over. And the user page exists, but there's still no real identity state behind it yet, so there's nothing meaningful for that page to really show you. So, part two is really just the point where this stops being just a shell and starts becoming an actual system. This is where we begin teaching the app how to take in employee data, hold on to what it's already seen, compare one version of that data to the next, and figure out what actually changed from one point in time to another. And that part matters because once the app can recognize the change, it can start making decisions about each person based on what has happened. Did someone get hired? Did someone move departments? Did someone leave the company? Or did nothing change at all? That is the core job here. Everything else we build later depends on the app being able to answer those kinds of questions correctly. Because the whole idea here rests on one simple question. What has changed? And in identity processing, that question can mean everything. At its core, it basically just means life cycle detection. When you are looking at employee data from one point in time and comparing it to employee data from another point in time, you're basically trying to understand where each person is according to their identity lifecycle. An employee spreadsheet is basically just a snapshot of this in more detail. And the real job is basically comparing the snapshots to the last one and figuring out the changes for each person. There are really only four possible answers for this. Somebody is brand new, so you add them. Somebody's information's changed, so you update them. Somebody's left the company, so you mark them as gone. Or nothing's changed, so you leave them alone. That process of detecting where someone is in their life cycle has a name in the industry. It's called joiner, mover, leaver, or JML for short. And pretty much every major system that manages employee identities works this way under the hood. Now, for the app data to do any of that correctly, it just needs one specific thing. It needs something old to compare the new stuff against, as we talked about over and over. Because you can't spot a change if you've only ever seen one version. That's why the lab comes with two files. The first one is your starting point. Think of it as a snapshot of the company today. The second one is the same company a month later with a few specific changes that are different on purpose. And those differences show up in four people. Maya is the new hire, so she only shows up in the second file. Jordan is the one who moved around, transferring from sales over to HR. Chris is the one who left the company, and Sam is the one who doesn't change at all. Sam matters way more than it sounds like he should because Sam is how we prove the app knows when to just leave someone alone. So, what actually got added between part one and part two to make all of this possible? Six things, really. The app actually reads the files you upload now instead of just tossing them. It double checks every row before anything gets saved, so a broken file can't really mess up your data. It remembers what the company looked like the last time, so the next upload has something to compare against. It sorts basically every person in the file into one of the four groups we just talked about. It updates the people who changed and leaves the rest alone. And every decision it makes gets written down in a running history log, so later on you can look back and see exactly what happened and why. All of this behavior lives in one file, and that's where we're basically going next. That file that we talked about is called app.py, basically a Python file. And the most important piece of it is just the part that handles the uploads. And part one, that part was basically a doorbell that with no one home, okay? The files came in, but nothing really happened. And part two, it's where all the real thinking occurs. When a file comes in, the app reads it, checks what it already has stored, compares the two, figures out what kind of change each person represents, saves the result, and then writes the whole thing down. If you end up reading the code yourself later, there are three things worth paying attention to: how the file actually gets read, how the app decides that something has changed, and how it handles each of those four groups differently. Let's take that last one and actually unpack it. Because every single person in that file is going to land in one of these four groups, as we mentioned before. A new hire is someone who shows up in the file but isn't in our records yet. An update is someone who's already in there, but something about them has changed. A termination is basically a special kind of update where the change is specifically that they've left the company, and we flag that one separately because it matters more from a standard security point. And then there is the no change group, which is the quiet one. The person is already in our records. Everything still matches, and the app just kind of moves on. That just moves on part is more important than it sounds. It means you could run this twice in a row or 10 times in a row, and the extra runs would just do nothing because there's nothing new to do. That property actually has a name. It's called idempotency. Okay, it's a really hard word, which it basically just means safe to run over and over without breaking anything. And that's why this kind of setup is safe to run on a schedule later instead of only by hand. Speaking of running it, let's actually walk through what that looks like. Now, running this stuff, as we said on a schedule, is going to be part three's problem, but here's where we're going to try doing it by hand to kind of show you this process. You basically start by uploading the first file and having the app memorize the starting point. After that, you check the user's page to make sure it came through and then upload the second file. That way the app can kind of compare the two and have all of our test accounts show up exactly how we want them to. Now, there's a quick fork in the road before we go any further. If you're coming in fresh, please skip the next slide and meet me at the setup part. If you've already built part one with me, stick with me for 30 seconds. So, if you've already have part one sitting on your computer, good news, you don't need to start over from scratch. All you're going to do is just open up part one folder right now next to the unzipped part two folder and copy the new files over to the old ones. The files you need to swap out are listed right there on your screen, so just your existing database file can kind of stay where it is because nothing about how the data is stored has actually changed, so nothing breaks when you drop these new files in. Once that's done, you're basically caught up with everyone else, which means we can jump into the next part of the setup together. Now, the setup is the same routine we ran last time. Open the project in VS Code and pull up the built-in terminal. Install what the app needs with the pip install, our requirements.txt, and then start it up with Python appy.py. It'll print out basically a local web address in the terminal. You'll open that up in your computer, and once the dashboard comes up, you're ready to load the first file. This first run is basically all about teaching the app what the company looks like before anything changed. Okay, so when you head over to the upload page, grab the first file from the sample folder and hit process. You're going to give it a second and then it's going to open the user's page. Georgian is going to be sitting in sales. Chris is still with the company. Maya isn't on a list at all yet because she hasn't really been hired in this version. And Sam is exactly where you would expect him to be. This is the starting point the app is going to compare the file against. All right, so let's give it that next file. Now, when the user page loads after uploading the second file, everything we changed or planned to change out on slide 4 should be sitting there right in front of you. Maya's been added with sales associate as her title. Dana Brooks is listed as manager. Jordan has moved over to HR with a new title and a new manager to match. Chris is still on the list, but now he's marked as gone, which is, a real setting. Something would kick off every other system forward, to cut off his access. And Sam is untouched because, Sam didn't really need to be touched for any reason. No changes occurred. Now, all 4 people handled correctly from a single upload, all right? So how did the app actually figure all of that out is mostly or usually people's question. Now, it figured this out by running through an 8-step process every single time a file comes in. It reads the file into memory, it checks every row, and then anything that looks broken gets kicked out before it can touch the stored data. Then it grabs each person's employee ID and looks it up in the records. The employee ID is the anchor here. Names change, email addresses change, departments change, but the ID stays the same forever. So that's what the app uses to identify people. If it doesn't find the ID in the records, it'll treat it as a new hire. If it does find it, the app basically compares the old info to the new info piece by piece, and that comparison is what decides whether this is an update, a termination, or a no change. Then it saves the result and writes it in a line into the history log describing exactly what it did. And basically, that history log is so you can kind of double check what the app actually did and to make sure that everything occurred as it was supposed to. But to do that, you're going to need to look into two places, all right? The users page basically shows you the current state of every employee straight from the database. And the 4 people from our demo should look exactly the way they would. All right. The history log should show you the whole story. All right. A timestamp list of every addition, update, and termination, along with which file to set it off. Um, Keeping a history log like this basically feels like overkill in a small learning project, but in a real company, it is non negotiable. Rules like SOX and ISO basically exist to make sure that this kind of record gets written because if it's not, and a compromise happens, it's really hard to figure out where these people came from or where a breach might have occurred. So if you build the habit now, you won't be scrambling to add it later when someone really needs proof when a bad thing happens. Now, what does this whole project actually give you? All right. A clear answer to the question of what changed, all right? And that answer is the foundation of everything else in the world that identity rests on, okay? You can't give someone access until you know they got hired. You can't take away access until you know they've left. And you can't prove any of it to an auditor without a written record of what happened and when. So, in essence, part 2 is just the layer that gives you those answers cleanly and repeatedly every time a new file comes in, which means the app in front of you right now is actually doing something real. All right, it's a working engine for handling employee identity. It takes company data in, sorts every person into the right bucket, updates the stored records, and leaves behind a trail that explains itself. That is the same core pattern the big identity platforms like Okta and SailPoint are built around. In part 3, we're basically going to take everything in this engine is figuring out and actually use it to control access. Maya automatically gets into the right groups for her new role. Jordan loses his old sales access the moment the app sees his move and picks up his new HR access in the same run. Chris is going to lose everything, the second he's marked gone, which is how our offboarding is going to be simulated to work. And, that's the point where the whole lab kind of stops feeling like a learning project and starts kind of looking like something you can actually run at a working station. Now, before we get there, here's going to be where you find everything. All right. It's all linked in the description and pinned in the comments below. The slide deck is there, and so is the full part 2 lab kit. The lab kit is the exact code that I just ran and that you will run, so you can unzip it, follow the steps from earlier, and have this thing running on your own machine pretty quickly. The references on the screen are the official documents for the 4 tools that this lab is built on, so if you want to dig deeper into any of those, you can. If any of this clicked for you, a like genuinely helps. Okay, it helps me find the next person, and it also helps me know that you guys are interested in this stuff. So, no likes happen, I just move on to the next topic or kill a series. So, subscribe if you want a part 3 the moment that it drops, because that's where we are going to take everything we just built and put it even more to work. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. So, I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.